On June 28, 2025, at exactly 0643 hours local time, the USS John Finn, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, crossed into contested waters west of the Paracel Islands. The sky was overcast. The sea was calm. But beneath the surface, tension was mounting by the second. On board, the crew was running standard patrol protocols. Electronic warfare teams monitored open frequencies. Radar operators tracked surface and air contacts. The ship's Aegis system was active, feeding real-time data into the CIC, the Combat Information Center. All of it routine, all of it by the book, until it wasn't. Roughly 12 nautical miles out from Triton Island, a Chinese Type 052D destroyer appeared on radar, then another, then a third. The trio of ships had not been transmitting AIS signals. They had not responded to hails. They were running silent and tight, a combat formation, not an escort detail. The John Finn's captain gave no reaction. He didn't need to. The crew knew what this meant. This wasn't a freedom of navigation encounter anymore. This was something else. At 0647, Chinese warships activated targeting radar. Seconds later, a KJ-500 AEW aircraft flying overhead locked its surveillance grid onto the Finn's position. It was no longer a shadowing maneuver. It was a challenge. The message came across in clipped Mandarin over Channel 16, a direct threat. Leave immediately or face consequences. The American destroyer held course. 3 minutes later, everything erupted. A Chinese Type 22 missile boat surged forward at high speed, cutting across the Finn's bow at less than 500 yards. Another dropped acoustic decoys. Then, from the south, a low-flying WZ-10 attack helicopter dipped into view, its stub wings visibly loaded. But the John Finn wasn't moving alone. It had been watching. It had been listening. And what China thought was a cornered American destroyer was about to become a trap. At 0651 hours, the USS John Finn altered speed by just 2 knots, barely perceptible on radar. But to anyone watching closely, it was a signal. From 42 nautical miles northeast, the USS William P. Lawrence, another Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, activated its AN/SPY 1D radar. Aegis to Aegis link came online instantly. Both ships now shared a combat picture in real time. This was not a lone patrol. The Chinese fleet didn't know it yet, but they had just stepped into a layered net, part naval, part digital, and entirely American. By the time the WZ-10 helicopter made its second pass, the John Finn systems had already completed a full EW profile of its emissions. It wasn't just flying low, it was mapping, scanning for gaps, testing response time. Unseen beneath the surface, nearly 25 nautical miles to the south, the USS Illinois, a Virginia-class fast attack submarine, was tracking the Chinese destroyers acoustically. Her towed sonar array had picked them up 40 minutes earlier, long before they'd come into view on surface radar. To the Chinese crews above, this still looked like a simple standoff. They believed they were outnumbering and surrounding a single American ship, but the U.S. fleet had gone silent for a reason. They weren't broadcasting strength because they were setting the board. At 0653, a single burst transmission was sent from the Finn's EW deck, less than 1.2 seconds long. Compressed, encrypted, directional. It went out on a beam aimed straight toward Diego Garcia and was instantly relayed to the Pentagon. China had crossed the threshold. In the CIC, the tactical screen was now glowing with red indicators. The Chinese destroyers were repositioning again, this time in a flanking pattern. The Finn's captain gave a single order: deploy Ghost Net. From the stern, 6 UAVs launched into the gray sky, small, fast, and nearly invisible on radar. They weren't armed, they weren't needed for that. Their job was different: blind the enemy, spoof infrared, scramble targeting locks, and feed China a picture they couldn't trust. This was no longer a freedom of navigation patrol. This was a live test of American multi-domain dominance, and China was now operating blind. At 0656, everything changed. The lead Chinese destroyer, hull number 173, the Changsha, broke formation and angled 15 degrees to starboard, accelerating past 30 knots. It fired no missiles. It didn't need to. The movement alone was a message. This was not a drill. This was maneuver warfare. At the same time, the WZ-10 helicopter banked hard left and accelerated toward the Finn's port side. Its missile pylons were still locked, but its FLIR pod had gone active, scanning the Finn's deck layout in real time, frame by frame. Behind it, 2 Chinese Type 22 missile boats widened their flanks and began dispersing chaff, preparing to mask their radar profiles for a possible missile exchange. The Finn didn't flinch. On deck, her crew stayed at stations. The 5-inch Mark 45 gun remained silent. The Phalanx CIWS tracked but did not engage. From a distance, the ship still looked passive. But inside the CIC, targeting solutions were already finalized. At 0658, with a slight lurch forward, the Finn launched 2 RQ-21 Blackjack drones. They ascended quickly, cutting a clean arc toward the Chinese formation. These weren't for surveillance. These were digital sentries equipped with electronic attack payloads designed to jam frequency bands used by Chinese missile guidance systems. That same moment, deep underwater, the USS Illinois received its final fire authorization code. Target: the Hefei, China's second destroyer, positioned 19 nautical miles to the southeast. The Illinois didn't fire a torpedo. Instead, it released a single UUV, an autonomous underwater vehicle programmed to silently trail the Hefei and await acoustic confirmation of a missile launch. If China committed to a first strike, the response would be immediate and lethal. Back on the surface, the Chinese fleet continued to tighten its encirclement. But something wasn't adding up. Their radar returns were fragmented. Ghost signatures appeared along the horizon. IR scopes showed multiple hot contacts where no ships existed. And worst of all, their missile guidance telemetry had begun to fluctuate, just slightly, just enough to raise questions in their targeting software. They were inside a jamming field. One officer aboard the Changsha reportedly voiced the alarm. The picture was too clean, too obvious. Something was wrong. But by then, it was too late to back down. At 0700 hours sharp, the WZ-10 fired first. A single HJ-10 missile streaked towards the Finn's bow, and within 1.6 seconds, the entire Western Pacific lit up. The HJ-10 missile cut through the air just above sea level, its warhead locked on the heat signature of the Finn's forward deck. Alarms blared. Within milliseconds, the Aegis system responded. The destroyer's radar switched to active track, and the Phalanx CIWS, a 6-barreled Gatling cannon, roared to life. The missile never made it to the hull. At less than 350 yards from impact, the CIWS shredded the warhead mid-flight, detonating it in a burst of light and debris that scattered harmlessly into the sea. But the moment the Chinese fired, they crossed the threshold, and the USS John Finn was no longer restrained. At 0701, 2 RIM-162 ESSM missiles launched from the Finn's vertical launch system. Their targets, the WZ-10 helicopter and the lead Type 22 missile boat. The response was surgical. The ESSMs traveled at Mach 4, and within moments, both Chinese assets were gone. One exploded in the sky, the other sinking beneath the surface in under 4 minutes. Simultaneously, the USS William P. Lawrence, still holding position northeast, locked its radar onto the Changsha and launched a pair of SM-2 missiles. These weren't warning shots, these were kill shots. The first slammed into the Chinese destroyer's forward deck, blowing through its superstructure. The second struck midship, disabling propulsion. The Changsha began to drift, burning but afloat. Underwater, the USS Illinois waited, listening. The Hefei, still flanking wide, had yet to fire, but its sonar signature had changed. It was turning, slowly. Then a sharp shift. Turbines spiked. The sub's crew heard it clearly. The Hefei was preparing to launch. They didn't wait for the missiles to leave the tubes. The Illinois released a Mark 48 heavyweight torpedo. It traveled silently for 14 seconds before slamming into the Hefei's aft hull with a low concussive thud that ruptured its power plant and cracked its keel. There was no explosion, just a tremor. And then, nothing. The Hefei slipped below the surface and never came back up. By 0707, the battle was effectively over. 3 Chinese vessels neutralized, 1 submerged, 1 crippled, and a 4th, now isolated, fleeing southeast, its radar disabled and comms reduced to static. The Finn didn't pursue. It didn't need to. The message had already been delivered, not by broadcast, not by bluff, but by action. The engagement ended in just under 8 minutes, but the diplomatic aftershocks rippled for weeks. Back in Washington, the Pentagon held its breath. Satellites confirmed the kill zones, and a secure video feed from the USS John Finn showed the still-burning wreckage of the Changsha. Chinese rescue craft had entered the area, but not a single U.S. vessel advanced beyond the initial patrol boundary. Every move had been legally restrained, precisely measured, and intentionally undeniable. Beijing's first reaction came within hours. A statement from the PLA Navy claimed the clash was initiated by an unprovoked American strike. But that line didn't last long. Independent radar data from Japanese and South Korean tracking stations, along with thermal imaging from a French surveillance satellite, painted a very different picture. The international community saw the truth, and more importantly, they saw the restraint. The U.S. Navy hadn't just won the battle, it had won the narrative. In Brussels, NATO representatives held an emergency meeting. For the first time in over a decade, a live naval engagement had escalated between major powers. And yet, the measured response by the U.S. fleet set a new precedent, not just for deterrence, but for strategy. You don't always have to shout. Sometimes precision whispers louder. The loss of a guided missile destroyer, a missile boat, and an advanced helicopter wasn't just humiliating, it exposed gaps in their combat readiness. Social media within China was swiftly censored. Footage showing the burning Type 22 vessel briefly circulated online before being scrubbed entirely. But the outside world had seen too much. India, Taiwan, and Vietnam, all nations with tense maritime boundaries, issued indirect statements of support for the U.S. response. Naval experts across Asia began dissecting the battle like a case study. Military channels on both sides of the Pacific went into silent overdrive. Doctrines were re-examined, simulations were rerun, procurement lists were quietly rewritten, and one particular note, buried in a RAND Corporation analysis just days later, said it best: the U.S. did not simply respond to aggression, it anticipated it, absorbed it, and used it to reveal the weakness of a modern rival without starting a war. The USS John Finn returned to Guam 2 days later. Her crew was tight-lipped. No press, no statements. But inside naval circles, a quiet phrase started spreading. They thought it was a warning shot. We called it target practice. In the weeks that followed, something shifted across the Indo-Pacific. China's naval drills grew quieter, shorter, more cautious. The aggressive patrol patterns near the Spratly Islands were scaled back. A joint military exercise with Russia, scheduled to include simulated anti-carrier strikes, was quietly postponed. No official explanation was given. Meanwhile, the USS John Finn's actions became textbook study material, not only at the U.S. Naval War College, but in briefing rooms from Canberra to Tokyo. It wasn't the scale of the response that earned praise, it was the surgical discipline. The idea that in the age of modern brinkmanship, force projection is as much about what you don't do as what you do. Washington, for its part, didn't issue victory statements, no parades, no boasts. But behind closed doors, defense analysts and policymakers knew what this moment meant. This wasn't just a skirmish, it was a signal, a test, and one side failed spectacularly. For Beijing, the lesson was brutal. Their assumptions about intimidation, reaction time, and technological parity had been shattered in under 10 minutes. And worse, the entire world had seen it. One former U.S. admiral put it bluntly in an off-the-record interview. They brought a match to a thunderstorm and walked into it thinking they'd stay dry. The South China Sea is still contested. The tension hasn't gone away. But after August 2025, the rules of engagement changed, not through treaties or declarations, but through 8 minutes of precise firepower and unshakable restraint. And to the question of what happens next. Let's just say, China won't be pushing the line that far again anytime soon.